I'm Denise Murrow. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Global Governance and Human Security program at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And today I'm here with Professor Jeff Pugh, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance at UMass Boston. Jeff is also the executive director of the Center for Mediation, Peace, and Resolution of Conflict, or CEMPROC. His PhD in political science is from the Johns Hopkins University with an AB in political science and speech communication from the University of Georgia, where he was a foundation fellow. Professor Pugh's research focuses on the role of non-state actors and international institutions influencing governance and peace building in the global South, especially in migrant receiving areas of Ecuador. His book, The Invisibility Bargain, Governance Networks and Migrant Human Security, published by Oxford University Press, focuses on non-state actors and governance networks providing peace and security for Colombian migrants in Ecuador. Yep, there's the book. I have it here as well. Jeff has published articles in International Migration Review, Latin American Politics and Society, International Studies Perspectives, PS, Journal of Peace Building and Development, and Negotiation Journal, among others. And his work has been recognized with Best Paper Awards from the International Studies Association, Ethnicity, Nationality, and Migration section, the Migration and Citizenship section of the American Political Science Association, the Middle Atlantic Council of Latin American Studies, the New England Council of Latin American Studies, and his dissertation won the 2011 Peace and Justice Studies Association Best Graduate Dissertation of the Year Award. He was a 2014 through 15 Fulbright Scholar in Ecuador and served as the past president of the Middle Atlantic Council on Latin American Studies. So welcome, Jeff. I'm excited to talk to you about your book today.
Thanks, Denise. It's wonderful to be here.
And so today we're going to be talking about your new book, The Invisibility Bargain, Governance Networks and Migrant Human Security, which I understand has been several years in the making. So to kick us off, can you tell me about how you became interested in this area and how this project began?
In the University of Georgia, I was interested in Latin American studies and in peace and conflict. And so my initial introduction to Ecuador was one summer when I went and did a research project there. And then after graduating, I wanted to go back. And so I lived for a year in Ecuador, and that's when I founded CEMPROC, this organization that focuses on grassroots training and education in peace and conflict resolution. And so it was really as a practitioner that I first approached this topic of host migrant peace building, because in the summer of 2005, I was in Ibarra, Ecuador, where you're familiar with that town as well. I was there in the municipal government building together with a team of trainers from CEMPROC, from the UN High Commission on Refugees, UNIFEM, and some others. And we had brought together a group of Colombian and Ecuadorian women for a week of training, capacity building, and also sort of open dialogue. We had noticed that there was sort of a stigma around Colombian refugees in Ecuador. There were these sort of generalized stereotypes about Colombians being drug dealers and prostitutes and sort of associated with the armed conflict. And so the idea was to open up space and dialogue. And that week was very eye-opening for me. I saw some of these women really sort of transforming their own pre-existing attitudes. After hearing the personal stories of people from the other group, they said, okay, I had this idea in mind about who Colombians are, or on the other side, Colombians saying, I had this idea about who Ecuadorians are. And now listening to your story, I can't keep that same sort of stigmatized idea. I've got to rethink both how I think of the other group and what I'm gonna do. And so that really opened up an area of interest for me. And I guess I approached it as I want to figure out how that happens, how one can create these spaces for dialogue, for intergroup coexistence. And anytime a new group of people comes into a country, there is an adjustment period, right? There's a period of sometimes, almost always, some conflict as different cultures, different expectations are meshing. And so as conflict resolution practitioners, we all sort of share that, that interest in figuring out policies, procedures, practices, interventions for de-escalating conflict so it doesn't become violent. So that became my sort of central research agenda. It became my dissertation at Johns Hopkins University. And then later, after the dissertation was over and I was in my my teaching job, I really wanted to continue building the empirical core of the book. So after I liked the general framework that I had, but I really wanted better evidence to know for sure if the hunches that I had from observations really held up. And so with the Fulbright, I was able to go back to Ecuador over 2 summers and a series of other grants. I carried out 600 plus surveys in 6 different provinces of the country with migrants themselves, and then about 170 interviews. A lot of those were with officials of the state or the NGOs, UN officials, etc. And so I wanted to talk to as many of the stakeholders as possible to get a sense of how are people coping with these conflicts that happen in migrant receiving communities, what are the strategies they're using, and what are kind of best practices in order to learn from the example of Ecuador and apply those lessons elsewhere.
Okay, great. I really find it fascinating how the research kind of, this long research agenda got its start in more practitioner-based work. I think that really speaks to just how on the ground and the sort of practical implications that your work has. So as you pursued this research agenda, was there anything along the way that surprised you or that you found to be a twist and took you in an unexpected direction?
Yeah, so I think actually that point about starting as from a perspective of a practitioner set me up for one of my first surprises, because I came into this with the idea that I just articulated: how can we design policies, right? What can the government do, or what can NGO leaders, what kind of program can they set up to help resolve these conflicts? And so that already had an assumption of where the agency was in these kind of helpers or in the government. And what I soon learned was it may not be what is the best policy the government can design. It may actually be sometimes the government is the problem, in the sense that, in a democracy, citizens are the ones who vote. And often, at least in the case of Ecuador, migrants mostly are not voting. And so a government has a political incentive to respond to the interests and incentives of its constituents. Sometimes those incentives say scapegoat the migrants, because it's much easier to blame them for our problems than to sort of grapple with the complexity. And so what I started to realize when I really got into the field was it's not just as simple as designing a good program or a good policy. It's really more structural to some extent. It's how do the relationships among these different kinds of organizations, civil society, the UN system, and the state, create a network of governance that allows for resilience, that allows for migrants themselves to navigate among the resources that are there, get access to those resources, and then have their grievances, their needs, their sort of goals articulated, also in a way that doesn't invoke a backlash from the host community. That was one of the things that I learned along the way, was some of the things that had been tried. When the UN came and said, let's set up protections put up tents for a refugee camp like we've done in other countries, pour resources and fund aid to refugees. Those were all good things, but they also had sort of a backlash. Ecuadorians looked at that and said, well, wait, we're poor too, and all these resources are going to these newcomers. And so it almost increased conflict between refugees and their host community. And so there was a learning process that happened. So what I was trying to figure out were what were some of the strategies that refugees and migrants in general were learning, were using to get what they needed, to have agency over things that affected their own lives, but that wouldn't sort of cause a backlash, wouldn't make their life worse. And that's where this concept of the invisibility bargain that I use in the book came from, was identifying that.
How did this project eventually evolve into a book, and were there any obstacles along the way?
Lots of obstacles, as you can imagine, with something that I trace back 15 years. But I think it always was a book project in my mind. But one of the things that evolved along the way was me liberating myself from the boundaries I put around that. And what I mean by that is different kinds of ideas are appropriate for different sorts of sort of scholarly outputs. And there are things that are great focused kind of questions that an article will do justice to. And this felt like a bigger thing than that. I needed the kind of room that a book provides to really develop an argument and then systematically test it out empirically. And so it felt like it needed to be a book. At some points, what I was struggling with was it seemed like more than a book. I kept coming up with these related questions that I had that were part of a sort of the same research agenda, but if I put them in the book, it would be unwieldy. And so what I learned from that is it's really nice to have a research agenda. You think of it kind of as a constellation of related efforts that are kind of coordinated, moving in the same direction, but not all the same project. So the core of the project was developing the concept of the invisibility bargain and then developing an argument of networked governance, this idea that structures of networks of institutions and organizations, including informal groups, is really key to understanding how refugees are able and migrants are able to access protection, human security, and sort of live in peaceful coexistence with their host communities. But a lot of the things that I kept running into, like I was fascinated by discourse, because it's not just an institutional story about how organizations interact. It's also, host societies have a sort of social construction of what refugees are, how they think about them, whether they see them as potential new members of society or as threats to be rejected or as sort of others to keep some distance from. And so I was really interested in figuring out how these different narratives competed with each other and how they influenced the actual treatment of refugees. So what I started to do was have several article projects that were part of this overall agenda, and I published them along the way, because it's hard to have a 10, 15-year project for a book and not have a payoff in all that time. So the articles were a way that I could be getting things out there that are contributing to the conversation, and that sort of lead toward and support and scaffold the argument that I developed in the book. And I think that was useful. It also helped me to feel like I had a kind of a reciprocal approach to doing the research itself. I was always very aware of what I was asking people when I said, would you please sit down with me for an hour for an interview? Or refugees, could you please come here and fill out this survey? That was an ask that required something from them, and I didn't have anything to offer in return. And so what the little I could do was always have some kind of summary of results so far that I could offer them and say, here's what we have so far that might be useful in your organizing, advocacy, in program design, etc. So there was something in it for them as well as for me. And just as the agenda started as a practitioner, I wanted that on the other end as well. So as I learned more about what the strategies were that people were using, what worked, what was likely to make it worse, to translate that into really actionable recommendations. And in the conclusion of the book, there's a whole bunch of bullet points for different actors that are like, based on the findings of this book, here are some recommendations that are pretty practical, things that you could put into place. And with my organization, SIMPROC, our director, Omar Rodriguez, and I designed a series of trainings, and together with the Mennonite Church in Quito, actually did a series of workshops for refugees, did capacity building. So they were trained as sort of informal peer mediators, or like a little community mediation program within the church, so that migrants and Ecuadorians together could co-mediate disputes that came up, for example, between a migrant tenant and a Ecuadorian landlord or something like that, and help to transform some of the power imbalances. And so having those sorts of practical outputs that came out of the learning from this project, I think was something that was important to me. And it also helped to sort of accept the long time frame to the book, that there were these other things that could come out of it as well.
So can you tell me a little bit more about the book and your central argument? You've mentioned you coined this concept, the invisibility bargain. So can you explain what that means?
Sure. Yeah, the name for it came a little bit later than sort of identifying the pattern. But the pattern that I noticed pretty early on, and especially when I started comparing Ecuador to other cases, I did field work in South Africa for a month right after a wave of xenophobic violence. I had experience in the United States. The town I grew up in Forsyth County, Georgia, at one point was the fastest growing county in the country. And a lot of that was because of migration, sort of going, Mexican and other Latin American populations going from the gateway cities that were traditional sites of migration and moving further into the country. And so as I looked at all these different receiving localities, I noticed there were anti-immigrant sentiments that sometimes were expressed. People were talking about fears about competition for jobs. They had worries that as more people came in, and especially folks who might be willing to work for lower wages, that would create competition for people in the host community and affect their prospects for jobs. There were fears about cultural differences, and that people coming from other cultures would kind of erode a sense of cohesion within a community. These were common fears that people had, but it wasn't just that, let's kick them all out. There were also strains of, we need new people here, right? We need labor. We need the skills that migrants often have. Some people were aware enough of the real research and fact that migrants are more likely to be job creators. They're at least twice as likely as people who are native citizens to be entrepreneurs, to start a new small business, and that creates jobs for others. Diversity of cultures kind of enriches a social fabric and brings new exciting things to a community. And so it wasn't as simple as either a community is sort of anti-immigrant or pro. And it seemed like there was a sort of expectation that could be either met or violated. And so the invisibility bargain concept says that in most receiving communities, there is a tolerance, a willingness to accept migrants' physical presence in the community, in the country, as long as they're perceived to be holding up their end of some bargain. And the rules of this bargain are usually informal, unwritten, but everyone kind of understands them. And especially if they're violated, there's a backlash. And so the three key expectations I found that tended to pop up in all of these cases were that the migrants are perceived to be contributing economically to the host society, either through needed labor or skills or whatever, that they remain politically and socially invisible. And what I mean by that is the political invisibility piece is actually the strongest expectation I found, that there was an expectation, sort of a logic of gratitude, the idea that this is our country, we're allowing you to come in, and so you don't really have the position or the standing to make demands, to assume that you have rights that give you the option to sort of demand things from the government. So as long as you're here and are being grateful for the opportunity to be here, and not, for example, engaged in political activism, going out in the streets and protesting, making demands that the government should pursue particular policies, then we'll let you stay. And the social invisibility bargain expectation is the idea that migrants are not visibly expressing very different cultural manifestations. And that can play out in race, religion, language. So if the Muslim headscarf, the hijab ban in France is an example of this. When women were wearing hijabs in public spaces, that created some backlash on the part of French society that said that is a visible expression that is against our norm of secularism here. And so that's not what we want. And there was a backlash. In the US, you've probably heard news stories sometimes of people accosting someone in the Walmart when they hear them speaking in Spanish or Korean in public spaces. Again, that's the sort of expectation that you can be here, but don't magnify your difference in public spaces, right? To the extent that you're seen as opposing some kind of social or cultural norm that's important to the dominant society, that's going to cause backlash. And so the output here is that there's an expectation that host societies want to benefit from, and to some extent extract the benefits, economic benefits especially, from migrant presence, but to cause depoliticization, almost passivity on the part of the migrant population. And it leads to a really precarious existence where their presence is accepted, but their real sort of full personhood is not. There's an expectation that says you can choose whether to really be your full person with all of your sort of the things that are important to you culturally, but that will make life worse for you. That will cause a backlash. And you have to kind of give up your claims to rights and just take what you're given. And so there's this sort of precarity, a liminal status where people exist, but without really much access to rights. And so in that context, the state isn't necessarily the best provider of protection. As I mentioned before, they have some political incentives to say, yeah, let's keep migrants in this sort of limbo status, and even encourage scapegoating, because that focuses the problem on them and not on us. And so what I observed was there, non-state actors become a really important part of the story. NGOs, the church, UN High Commission on Refugees, and other parts of international organizations that may have different kinds of incentives and mission than the state does. Those groups step up as providers of services, providers of protection. They help to organize and articulate some of the the things that migrants say they need, they want, their goals, and provide spaces where migrants can organize themselves and can actually develop a sort of collective voice. And because the non-state actor is acting almost like a broker or an intermediary, they can then advocate directly with government, and there's a trust issue too. Migrants tend to have a lot more trust in non-state actors than in state ones, because state is both the provider of security and protection and the enforcer of laws, and sometimes that double role can cause migrants to fear them, that enforcement role will be used against them. And so the non-state actor becomes kind of a broker intermediary that helps to connect migrants who trust them more with state agencies or other non-state actors that have the resources, that have the kind of job listings or legal status or whatever it is that's needed to access that protection. So that's where this sort of governance network argument comes from, that in those areas where the networks of actors is diverse and dense, migrants are going to have more access points to get what they need, right? So it's not just lots of actors, it's that non-state actors are well connected with state ones, and there's international organizations, and all of them are coordinating together. That makes it much more likely that migrants will be able to navigate this sort of institutional arrangement and access the protections they need, have their voice heard by people who can, include that perspective in designing the policies that affect migrant lives.
Mm-hmm. And what kinds of strategies did you find migrants using to sort of negotiate within that invisibility bargain? Was it primarily through those non-state actors, or were there other strategies that also came into play?
Yeah, so there's kind of a paradox here. I asked migrants actually in the survey, of all these different strategies, which ones have you done, which could you imagine doing, and which would you never do? And what I found, the things that they said they either had done or could imagine doing were mostly things that were individual actions, didn't require collective action or organizing. Things like contacting the UNHCR and asking for an appointment, or writing to the news media or other stuff like that. When I asked them, of the things you've done, which ones worked? It was a little bit of a different story. And basically the dividing line was between those things that were more informal and less visible versus those things that were overt and visible. So public protest was seen as the least likely thing they either would do or could imagine doing. Whereas the thing that worked best was negotiating informally with local leaders and power brokers. So that actually could require some collective action, but it's still this informal, less visible kind of action, to negotiate with your neighborhood leader to have access to water, for example, or to negotiate with the local church to have a community work day that would do something that migrants in the community needed. Those kinds of things tended to work best. The paradox part is, when I asked individual migrants about their strategies, they often said, I just am withdrawing from social spaces because when I go out in public, people hear my accent. In Colombians in Ecuador, that's the primary kind of marker of difference that sets them apart. You can't necessarily tell a Colombian just by looking at them, but the accent really is what sets them apart. And they said, when I'm in the street selling my empanadas, someone hears my accent, they will sometimes say horrible things to me. The police will come up and question me or take my merchandise away or say my documents are fake and threaten me with deportation. And so I've sort of stopped going to social spaces. I stay home and keep my mouth shut. And so that was one survival strategy, is withdrawing from social spaces. Another one that people did on an individual basis was trying to minimize the social sort of visible differences. They learned to reduce their accent. They tried to use words that sounded more like things Ecuadorians would say. Colombians are seen as sort of more outgoing, and Ecuadorians, at least in the Sierra, in the mountainous region, tend to be sort of a little quieter, use sort of polite little ito at the end of a word to sort of have a diminutive to it. And so Colombians would start using those turn of phrases to reduce the sort of culture clash that just their existence had sometimes. And that was seen as a strategy, as sort of try to appear more Ecuadorian. And in other receiving countries, you see that with especially second generation immigrants sort of rejecting some of the cultural markers of their parents, immigrants, saying, I don't want you to speak our language in public because that's going to cause harm to you. So that was a strategy people used. And the paradox part is that the more people withdrew from public spaces and sort of repressed their Colombianness, so to speak, the less likely they were to build these relationships with Ecuadorians. If you're not out in public spaces meeting Ecuadorians, you're not going to know as many of them. And so that was designed as a protective strategy, so they wouldn't invoke this backlash. But following from contact theory, we found that when people did have relationships with the other group, with Ecuadorians, they tended to have more positive views of each other. They tended to have a better chance of accessing institutional spaces. There were a lot of benefits from having those networks. And so the sort of individual strategy to withdraw actually, I think, made it harder to do the things that worked to access these networks.
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you, so you've mentioned governance networks. I know the book is also about migrant human security in this Invisibility Bargain. And of course, your work connects with conflict resolution and peace building and these fields. And as a professor in this unique and interdisciplinary Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance, how do you see your work connecting to those different concepts and fields and bringing them kind of in conversation with one another?
So it really is at the intersection of those three clusters of conflict resolution, human security, and global governance. The initial impetus emerged from the conflict resolution part, the desire to find ways to build peace, to create a society, or to contribute to a society where people with these kinds of significant differences can coexist, can sort of transform their own views of identity and of community so they could build a new we instead of just being us and them in a shared space. And so that's kind of a core insight from conflict resolution. And to some extent, my dependent variable, what I wanted to see if it goes up or down, was at this intersection between conflict resolution and human security. The idea that the groups can coexist peacefully, there is a reduction of violence, that attitudes are more positive towards each other, and from the human security part, that people are feeling protection, right? That I like to divide this as rights, resources, recognition, and protection are kind of one shorthand way of describing what human security is about. Freedom from fear of harm and freedom from need, and that's the resources part. So the independent variable, what explains, when you're going to have better protection, better peace, comes from the governance part, the global governance part. And the idea of global governance, as opposed to government or international relations, is really a recentering away from the state as the only or central actor. The state is certainly an important actor, and maybe the most important actor in some cases. Here I'm making the argument that it's one of several really important actors. And global governance says these actors can be at multiple levels. So the UN High Commission on Refugees is this big, global institution, based in the UN, but it's also an office that has people on the ground in Ibarra and Esmeraldas and Quito, et cetera. And they have a different source of authority than the state does. Early on, when the Colombians were first coming in, the UNHCR was really the main one that had capacity to deal with it. In that first 7 years or so, in the book, I call it the absence period, because the state really just didn't know what to do with this huge population coming in. They didn't have the capacity. And so the UNHCR was the one registering people, interviewing them, and making recommendations to the state about whether they should be refugees or not. And so, you had in that case, and in the next phase, which I call coordination, a really close working relationship of these global actors like the UN High Commission on Refugees, UN Development Program, and the International Organization of Migration, with state agencies and non-state actors. The Catholic Church in Ecuador is a really key actor. And in those first 7 years, they were also some of the main ones on the humanitarian side, dealing with the refugee flow. And so governance is kind of who can produce public goods, outcomes, and help to coordinate collective efforts in a way that helps people. And that could be the government, but it could also be a combination of actors that have different sorts of authority. So here I draw on a concept that comes from actually my dissertation advisor, Margaret Keck, when she talks about practical authority in her book with Rebecca Abers. And the idea is that authority isn't just something that you have because of the title of your job or your government agency that says, I have the jurisdiction here. It's also something that you have because people trust you, or because you have the resources to make something happen for people. So it's much more flexible and malleable, and sometimes it's held by other actors than the state, and the state may not be the one with the practical authority in some spaces. In lots of parts of Ecuador outside of the capital city, the state was relatively absent for most of this period. It didn't have a very big presence. And so the church or sometimes an NGO might be the main institutional actor that could be the governance provider. And so I really wanted to be able to map those, to understand them in a more nuanced way. So that is directly feeding into what we learn in this department and what sets us apart from just a standard international relations department.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for making those connections explicit. So clearly your book has implications for these different fields and for scholars in these different fields. What other kind of impact do you hope your research and the book have?
Yeah, I hope that folks on the ground who are working with migrant populations will read it and kind of reorient some of their thinking about what the job is, right? So it's not just what's the best policy that you can put out there. That there is a significant gap between the formal institutions and laws and what happens in practice. And in Ecuador is actually one of the big stories that comes out of this analysis is Ecuador is one of the leaders in the world in terms of kind of progressive constitution laws for migrants and refugees. It's been internationally recognized for that. But the gap between those formal policies and reality can be quite big. And so understanding the informal spaces and have that be part of what you're trying to strengthen and promote, I think could be healthy. There is a tendency to want to only focus on capacity building for official actors. And I think that, those wanting to support peace building and human security in refugee and migrant spaces would be well served to also invest in things like bringing different kinds of actors together to meet each other and have sort of organizing spaces. In several of the provinces we visited, there were what they called mesa de movilidad. It's like a round table or a working group around migration. It had lots of different actors from the state and from NGOs, and support that, right? Give organizations some incentives to participate, maybe a little budget so that those working groups can have recommendations and implement things, and also be comfortable with informal actors playing a role, right? The migrant organizations themselves sometimes played a key role. And I point to the constitutional process, especially. There was a legal aid clinic in Quito run by a very junior, young woman who had worked briefly for the Ministry of Foreign Relations and then sort of started this refugee aid clinic. She had relationships with a number of refugee organizations, and they came together, developed a set of recommendations, brought people with just a little bit of budget from refugee leaders from different parts of the country, and had a workshop where they designed a sort of recommendation list. And then she drew on her political capital and social capital. She was buddies with the secretary of the president of the Constituent Assembly that was drafting the new Constitution in 2008. And she was able to get an appointment, went with 3 or 4 of the refugee leaders that she had been working with, and they went and presented their list that drew on this sort of collective voice of the refugees. She was the one that made the appointment, so it didn't invoke the sort of political invisibility backlash. But the refugees were there telling their stories. And she said that was really powerful, that the Constituent Assembly members, some of them were in tears afterwards. You had this combination of the personal rehumanizing narratives from the refugees themselves with this sort of technically useful document that said, if you want to put refugee protections in the Constitution, here's what we think it should look like. And in my book, I have a table where I show the language that they had in that document and the language that ultimately came out in the Constitution, and they're pretty similar. So it had a real impact that then created a framework that activists could draw on for years afterwards and kind of hold the state accountable for those protections. So that's impact. And that initial workshop that they had bringing together these people was kind of on the fly. It didn't require a very big investment, but that's the kind of intervention that can make a real difference when you view long-term relationship building as the outcome, and not just, here's a nice, neat thing that fits in a box that you can tick off and have an evaluation at the end within a 1-year funding cycle. So I think donors and those wanting to support this work can take that away from this book and some of the other articles in this agenda is, resetting your horizon of success, that relationship building takes time, but is super important for having sustainable change.
Right. That does sound like some of the most meaningful impact coming from that relationship building and long-term thinking. So as we wind down, I'd like to ask, do you know what's next for you or for this research agenda?
Yeah, so I've heard from some of my colleagues and friends who are academics who've written books that for a lot of them, once they get to the stage of actually getting the book out, they're so sick of it, they never want to see it again. And I have to say, I have not felt that with this project. I still, after all this time, am excited by this agenda. I want to keep pursuing it. And so one direction I'm going in is continuing these sort of side scaffolding. I mentioned the discourse project. I have several articles that are actually in process right now, really trying to draw systematically and analyze how discourses are shaping the social construction of what migration is about, and specifically the securitization of migrants, whether they're viewed as threats, whether they're viewed as victims, villains, potential new members of the community, et cetera. And so that is ongoing. I have an article that's moving along with a former student. And the other sort of direction that this project is taking next is going outside of Ecuador. So, this I would describe more as a theory building exercise. There's certainly a lot of empirical work in it and trying to test the framework. But when you derive a theory from a context and then apply it to the same context, that's sort of a plausibility probe, an initial stage. But the next stage is to really figure out, okay, if this theory is true, what would we expect? And let's design pretty rigorous tests of it in other receiving contexts. And if it holds up there, then this is something we have to take seriously and can really try to apply more generally in other places. It's not just something describing Ecuador. So with a former colleague at my previous institution, Providence College, we've designed a survey that includes an embedded experiment in the US context, asking people about their perceptions of immigrant political activism. And it is really trying to very rigorously, using systematic evidence, test this idea of the invisibility bargain and also bring in a bit more nuance. What about the psychological predispositions that people have? How does that make a difference? Does it magnify the intensity of their backlash against perceived violations or not? And how does contact, this interaction thing that I mentioned, mitigate some of that intensity? So we've designed, using more sort of quantitative methods, a test of the theory in the US context. And then I'm interested also in comparing other countries that are also in the same boat as Ecuador. They've been sending countries of migrants, but also at the same time receiving countries of migrants. So how do they navigate that sort of dual role when they talk about migration? So one of the papers I'm working on right now compares Turkey, which is the largest recipient of refugees in the world, although they don't explicitly call them refugees, with Ecuador. And it also involves populism, since the leaders of both of those countries used a sort of populist governance style. And surprisingly, that led to very welcoming kinds of messages, right? After the past few years here in the US, populism has been associated with a kind of a right-wing rejection of immigration, but that doesn't seem to be the story everywhere. So I want to compare those two cases in order to try and figure out this linkage between populism and discourses around, especially positive and welcoming discourses around refugees. Why does that happen, and when might it happen? So those are some of the directions that this agenda is taking to move forward.
Great. Sounds like exciting work. And I'll definitely be keeping an eye out for those articles coming out.
Great, hope so.
So to conclude, what advice would you give to other scholar practitioners or even students as they're thinking about developing a research agenda and potentially writing a book?
Yeah. Don't take as long as I did, maybe. Although I will say that the length gave me a perspective that I don't think most people have when they have a sort of one-off project. They do their fieldwork and then go write the book. The fact that I did my fieldwork over the period of like 8 or 10 years in little bits. Like I would go for the summer and do, some things, go the next summer. That actually is something that I learned from, that being comfortable with a longer time frame has some benefits, and that you don't have to accomplish it all at one time. There's a sense of either I get a big grant and go do my fieldwork for 8 months or a year, or I failed. And my experience was different than that way of doing things, but I think it led to a richer book. I think in terms of sort of what makes a book writing process successful is persistence more than anything. Being willing to keep going on it and not give up, because it's very easy to do that, to burn out on a book or not slog through all the way. So persistence is probably the most important thing that people need to take. And also for me, it was really helpful, again, to liberate myself and think, first, the dissertation is not the end of the story, right? It's a starting point. There's other things you can do afterwards. So in my case, the dissertation doesn't look very much like the final book did. It has some things in common. It's on the same topic, but it's a different product altogether. And most of the empirical work for my ultimate book came after the dissertation. So to be aware that you can continue doing things and these side articles along the way, that not everything has to be in the same project. So I guess the big takeaway is think of yourself as what is the agenda, research agenda that excites you more than what is the particular product that you have to be working on at a particular moment. And that can sort of free you to organize things in different ways as the ideas evolve.
Great. Well, thank you for your time, Jeff, and congrats on the new book publication.
Thanks so much for your thoughtful questions and for inviting me to have this space. Appreciate it, Denise.
Great. You can find more information about Jeff's work and how to purchase the book on his website, jeffreypugh.com. You can also find the book on Amazon. And you can find the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance at our website and on social media. You can follow us to stay up to date about events, news, and the latest accomplishments of our faculty members, students, and alumni. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Conres Global, and on LinkedIn as the full department name, Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance.